So, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Bruce Matador. I'm the chair of the Africa Study Group, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event. I'm not going to be chairing, however. My vice chair, Sheikh Bangura, is going to be doing that, and I will just introduce him and then remove myself from the picture and let the panel discuss the very important topic. So Sheikh Bangura is a jurist who has been a member of the Africa Study Group for since it was first created, and he has worked extensively internationally on justice issues. He worked for the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. He's been involved with UN Drugs and Crime Organization and the ECOWAS Secretariat. He has worked in Canada for Citizenship and Immigration Canada, for Canadem, the Pearson Peacekeeping Center, and for CEDA, and been involved in many post-conflict and transition countries in Africa. So he has a PhD in law and is an independent consultant here in Ottawa. So with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to him, and I'll come back at the very end to flag to you some upcoming Africa Study Group events. Sheikh, over to you.
Merci Bruce pour cette présentation. Thank you very much, Bruce. Good morning. Bonjour à tous au Canada et en dehors du Canada. As part of our discussion series on governance and development issues in Africa, our last session in December 5th was on the theme governance and political processes in West Africa. Today's focus will be on the challenges of governance and security in Africa. De notre note conceptuelle pour cette session, nous estimons que la bonne gouvernance est indéniablement primordiale à l'Afrique et que défini de manière bien restrictive et globale, le concept de bonne gouvernance vise la transparence, le respect de l'état de droit, la lutte contre la corruption et la tenue des élections démocratiques au suffrage universel. The 2020 report by the Mo Ibrahim Foundation on African governance shows a decline on overall progress for the first time in a decade. This has been driven by a decline in security and the rule of law in some countries. The challenges to be met are multidimensional and call certainly and first and foremost on African states, but also on the international community to act. Today, we have three excellent speakers who will enlighten us on those challenges as well as the solution to be found. Please allow me to introduce the speakers. Nous avons d'abord le professeur Anne-Frise Gérard. Elle est directrice de la Basili School of International Affairs, qui est basée à Waterloo. Sa présentation portera sur l'Afrique orientale et australe. Elle enseigne au département des sciences politiques de l'université Wilfrid Laurier et elle est professeure invitée dans les universités de Ngumba en Ouganda, Djima en Éthiopie, Ndiala en Sierra Leone. Elle a été conseillère en matière de politique et stratégie de sécurité nationale auprès de plusieurs pays d'Afrique. Anne est décorée de la médaille du jubilé de diamant de la reine par le gouvernement du Canada pour sa contribution à la résolution des conflits et au dialogue politique national. Bienvenue à ce panel. The second member of the panel is Dr. Nyagale Bagayogo, and she is the president of the African Security Sector Network. Nyagale is joining us today from Paris. She will discuss West and Central Africa. She is a political scientist and has conducted extensive research on security system in French-speaking African countries, on Western security policies, and on African conflict management mechanism, focusing on the relationship between security and development. I have to mention that from 2010 to 2015, Nyagale headed the peacekeeping and the peace building program at the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie. Our third speaker, notre troisième intervenant, est Chris Roberts. Il est chargé de cours au département de sciences politiques de l'Université de Calgary et président d'African Access Consulting, une société de conseil professionnel en affaires et en développement politique axée sur l'Afrique. Il a très abondamment travaillé sur des projets de politique et de recherche en Afrique et ses travaux ont été amplement publiés. Il mettra en lumière les perspectives de la politique étrangère canadienne sur l'Afrique, notamment en ce qui concerne la relation entre le développement et la sécurité et les questions de gouvernance de la sécurité. Sans trop tarder, je vais passer la parole à nos intervenants, mais avant de le faire, je vais juste mentionner à nos participants auxquels je souhaite également la bienvenue, qu'ils ont la possibilité de poser les questions, bien sûr. Nous avons un cadre qui est réservé dans la section de questions et réponses. Donc, veuillez y taper vos questions. Je vais les compiler, les récupérer et puis je les transmettrai ici aux intervenants pour qu'ils puissent prendre position. Nous aurons 15 minutes pour chaque intervention et après nous aurons 45 minutes pour les débats. Professeur Anne Fitzgerald, vous avez la parole.
Merci.
The floor is yours.
Merci. C'est un plaisir. Thank you very much. And it's always a pleasure to speak at the CIC events. I think this is a fantastic space that you enable to have discussions like this. Real pleasure to be on the panel with Nyagale and Chris as well. I was very involved in the development of the African Security Sector Network, Nyagale, with your predecessor, Professor Ebo Hutchful, and I really applaud all the work that you and the network have done across the continent. I'd like to start with some general comments about the mandate of this working group, which is peace, security, and governance, with regards to some developments in Africa, and then move on to discussing the situation in Ethiopia, as I have been asked to, I work in both West and East Africa, but mainly my focus is on the Horn of Africa. So I'd just like to start off when we're talking about governance by saying that a lot of great work has been done on the continent with regards to governance. We often hear in the Western media a lot of coming in from the Mo Ibrahim Index and all of these more international frameworks that don't go into detail about the really good work on the ground, especially that being heralded forward by civil society. I think if we divide peace and security into two at the moment, let me just speak generally under security about the need for professional, accountable, and well-governed security sectors. And again, like governance, a lot of good work has been done here. But let's break it down to what's needed. Better curriculum involving academic institutions and having that curriculum feed into defense staff colleges, police staff colleges, border patrol colleges, etc. So having a more comprehensive approach to professionalism. And we're seeing a lot of that happening at the moment. Some of the centers of excellence in Ghana, in Senegal, in Nigeria, you have some excellent academic institutions in Nigeria, and the way they are opening up now to contributing to the National Defense University there is very impressive. South Africa for many years has been a real leader in defense transformation, and we have lots of good practice to earmark from that country as well. I think on the accountability side, we still have a lot of work to do here. And I think what I see from my work across the continent is that sometimes accountability programs that have been pushed by the donor community come in at too unrealistic a level, which doesn't represent the next logical incremental step for the sector that's being engaged. And I think that's a question that we might talk about more in the Q&A. What's the logical progressive set of steps towards better accountability, towards better leadership as well? Leadership is everything. Leadership cascades down to all levels. So the tone has to be set at the leadership level. And very often you find that a lot of current leaders across the security sector in African countries were the freedom fighters of yesterday that, in many cases, really put everything else in their life on hold to pursue different political objectives for the country and objectives concerning freedom and independence. So there is human capacity development at the top echelons that cannot be forgotten about in this context. And that issue has very much to do with the peace side of the peace and security equation. And in my experience across the continent, the pursuit of peace is all about good strategies and good policies. And we saw a wave between the early 1990s and the early 2000s where any strategies or policies, except for a few national examples, were being promoted through the poverty reduction strategy processes from the IFIs and the UN and World Bank system. And some of those processes gained traction and became homegrown development strategies, which over time started looking at things like conflict resolution and security governance. And from that rolled out some homegrown efforts to address national security strategies. But for me, having studied this across the continent for many years, you have a divide between those strategies and policies that have been really pushed by external consultants, external organizations, which then lack traction at the local level. And you have a few examples of homegrown processes, such as South Africa, Ethiopia. Rwanda's made some progress towards getting their own off the ground as well, which have gained traction because they are not beneficiaries of Western donor engagement, supply-driven processes. And so if you do a forensic on the contribution made by some of the peace and security strategies and policies across the continent, it is the homegrown ones that have really made their way. I mean, Sierra Leone is another example. The efforts of the Office of the National Security Advisor in the early 2000s and the benefits that brought. So the other issue to do with good peace going forward is a strong civil society. And this, in some African countries, has been slow to develop for many reasons. In some cases, civil society used to be seen as anti-establishment. So there was an issue about trust towards some of these organizations. In other countries, there were legal proclamations that forbid the establishment of these civil society organizations, especially in the area of security, justice, and human rights. And so in some cases, the civil society organizations that had the most traction and voice were quasi-government organizations. So there was an issue of partisanship there. But again, as I said, under the security sector issue, it was a step in the right direction. And if that is the kind of step quasi-governmental independent organizations required to push forward to greater independent organizations, then I think that is entirely reasonable. Parliament is also an important factor here, and sometimes we look at Parliament as a whole, but it's the strength of the parliamentary committees as well to exercise sufficient oversight, ask the right questions to the institutions and the guardians of security and peace throughout the government. So I think just generally, I would put those comments on the table about peace, security, and governance and the experience to date. Let me talk a little bit about Ethiopia now, which I was asked to do by the organizers. I'd just like to say that I've had the great pleasure and privilege of working in the country and in the region for the last 18 to 20 years. I'm also, therefore, I worked in Ethiopia with the former EPRDF administration as well as the new one. And have worked across many regions, and I've got friends across all of the regions, and many in the northern region of Tigray as well. I recognize that this is a highly sensitized debate about Ethiopia at the moment. It's sadly a debate that has become very polarized and divisive across social media. We've always worked with disinformation and misinformation in the news for many, many years, especially when it comes to conflict related issues. But I think in the age of social media, we have to recognize that this disinformation has hit a real crescendo that starts to play havoc with many lives on the ground, which is not a good thing. Following the overthrow of the Derg regime, the TPLF developed a model of ethnic federalism that they felt would work in the circumstances. This model was predicated on strong central governance and strong central federal security forces. And you know, some good came from the model. There was revolutionary economic progress and lifting the country out of extreme poverty that it was experiencing for many years. But there were aspects of the model that in my own research were deemed to be unsustainable. For example, with the economic model, it was quite a clever amalgam that was brought together of experiences of the developmental state model from different countries, the Asian tigers, part from Scandinavia, others. But the tricky part of that model was that it was predicated on the experience of countries that had homogeneous societies, where external financing and international financing was available to support the model, and where there wasn't such a diverse society and in some cases divisive parts of society as well. So that model was not wholly transferable, and it would encounter some problems and resistance at a certain stage. The other aspect that was destined to cause problems in Ethiopia was the regional security architecture. For those not familiar, there are regional militia forces as well as federal armed forces and federal police forces. There are regional police forces as well. That militia model was developed more based on the experience in the Somali regional state of Ethiopia, where it developed to counter a threat from the ONLF, the Ogaden National Liberation Front. But that model was emulated in Oromia, it was emulated in Amhara, it was emulated in Tigray, and those numbers continued to grow and bolster after the Abiy administration came into office. Why is it unsustainable? In my view, it is directly accountable to the regional presidents. In a true democracy, you may have, like we've experienced here in Canada and the US and other countries, regional leadership being from a different political affiliation than the federal leadership. So if you have two forces, especially with paramilitary capabilities, and this aspect of the Liu Heil special forces within that regional militia structure, it does have paramilitary capability. If you have disagreement between the regions and the center, then the potential for conflict is very high when you have those two chains of accountability. And it differs from the models that we're used to on this continent, which have accountability to both the region and the federal head. So let me move to, yes, I wrote a paper about 1.5 years ago that expressed a bit of a concern with what was going to happen with the outgoing TPLF leadership and the changes that were being introduced at quite a rapid pace in the new Abiy-led party. I think a lot of positive reforms were brought in. What worried me was the limited ceremony and the limited recognition of the contribution of the previous regime. So I guess you could summarize the limited political reconciliation in the party. And so what we have now, of course, is what we saw was a buildup to conflict in the north, with many factors leading up to that, which we can talk about in the question period. But then an attack on the armed forces, which happened on November 4th. It wasn't just one isolated attack, it was across many of the military outposts in the Northern Command. We now see a situation where there is still tensions going on in different parts of the region. There is a humanitarian situation. War is not without risk. Conflict is not without risk. There will be humanitarian costs that come with war, and there will be lingering armed elements at play, and the problem of weapons as well. And there were many weapons in circulation in the region, even dating back to when the farmers had a role to play in the overthrow of the Derg. It was a very heavily armed region. And with the exodus of governance and highly skilled and highly experienced security capacity of the former commanders from the ENDF going back to Tigray, you had potential for a strong combat capability and strong organization. So, without going into the details of the conflict, which I'm sure members of the audience are familiar with, and which we can talk about more in the question period, we are now at a stage where we have a long road ahead of us to ensure support to the region, to ensure rebuilding, rehealing, reconciliation, trying to actually bring any violence and hostilities to a close. We have a question mark over the role of Eritrean forces and whether or not we will see a political solution. There's a real lack of evidence behind all of these things at the moment because of a lack of access into the region. But we do see that access increasing. We see flights enabling travel back and forth from Mekelle to Addis Ababa, the country's capital. But there are issues concerning disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. I have contacts in Tigray at the moment who tell me that, you know, that's a real issue, that there are many people who don't mind stopping fighting and withdrawing from their activity with armed elements, but they do not want to give up their weapon. And we've seen this with other case studies across the continent. You know, that weapon means a lot to them. It's part of their life existence, badge on the shoulder. There's also an issue concerning the future regional security structure, which will have to be reformed, not just in Tigray, but across the country. There's also issues concerning Ethiopian-Sudanese tensions on the eastern border with Amhara regional state that are not going away. And this is surprising in a way because the alliance and cohesion between the two countries has been very good and cordial for the last 20 years. And you know, maybe some sort of mediation would be required to bring both to the table, especially considering other dynamics that play and other, let's just say, aspects of the supply chain around the issue concerning Ethio-Sudanese border tensions. So let me stop here, Sheikh, and pass it over to my fellow panelists, but very happy to engage in debate in the Q&A session.
Merci beaucoup Anne. Souhaitons vivement que la paix revienne en République d'Éthiopie. C'est bon pour l'Afrique et c'est bon pour le monde entier. Dr Bakayoko, vous avez la parole.
Merci beaucoup au CIC tout d'abord pour cette invitation et à vous, Dr Bongoura, pour l'animation de cette session. Thanks a lot, Anne, for your kind words. Yes, you know, Ebo Achpoul is still working at the ASS and is presently the executive secretary. And I just would like to mention the fact that the presentations that I will now make is based on the research that have been conducted together with Professor Ebo Achpoul, Robin Luckham from the UK, who was my former fellow at the Institute of Development Studies in the United Kingdom. And it is a research that I have also been developing when I used to teach at the Institute of Sciences Po Paris, where I was held my PhD. And in fact, it is about hybridity, and this research was funded by Canada. In fact, that's what I wanted to mention, and particularly by the IDRC. Je vais maintenant m'exprimer en français, puisqu'on a la chance de pouvoir avoir un panel bilingue. Et donc, nous sommes particulièrement reconnaissants au CERDI d'avoir été assez précurseurs, puisque entre 2014 et 2017, il nous a permis de conduire des recherches sur ce qu'on appelle l'hybridité de la gouvernance de la sécurité. C'est-à-dire que les travaux de recherche que nous avons menés dans le cadre de ce programme, qui portait non seulement sur l'Afrique de l'Ouest, sur laquelle je vais me concentrer là, dans le cadre de ma présentation, mais également sur l'Afrique australe et l'Afrique de l'Est, notamment le Somaliland, est parti d'un constat et d'une hypothèse de travail selon laquelle l'échec de la plupart des processus de gouvernance des systèmes de sécurité tient au fait que sur le continent africain, ils ont été essentiellement axés sur les cadres formels qui structurent le fonctionnement des systèmes de sécurité. C'est-à-dire que la plupart des programmes sont conçus en fonction d'une hypothèse weberienne qui suppose une légale rationalité de l'État, un monopole de la contrainte légitime, un équilibre des pouvoirs fondé sur des institutions indépendantes et des contre-pouvoirs. Et en réalité, on s'aperçoit qu'un tel schéma institutionnel n'est que partiellement le reflet de la réalité de la gouvernance de la sécurité sur le continent africain et en particulier en Afrique de l'Ouest, et en Afrique centrale, y compris dans les pays francophones, où l'on s'aperçoit que les mécanismes de gouvernance de la sécurité s'appuient sur des logiques à la fois complémentaires et parfois concurrentes, des logiques à la fois formelles et informelles. Alors, je vais détailler ce qu'on entend par cette interpénétration de ces dynamiques formelles et informelles qui gouvernent les systèmes de régulation de la sécurité dans les pays africains. D'abord, cette logique hybride se constate à travers le type d'acteurs qui sont mobilisés pour assurer la sécurité. C'est-à-dire qu'on s'aperçoit qu'à côté des forces de défense et de sécurité, qui sont légalement mandatées pour intervenir et être le bras armé de l'État, d'autres acteurs ont émergé au fil des années et se sont en réalité affirmés de manière de plus en plus croissante au détriment de ces forces de défense et de sécurité qui se sont révélées en réalité incapables d'exercer une autorité et une protection à la fois des institutions de l'État et bien entendu des populations sur des larges portions de territoire. Qu'il s'agisse du cas de la République démocratique du Congo, de la République centrafricaine, des pays sahéliens, particulièrement du Mali, du Burkina Faso, donc les 4 pays qui traversent aujourd'hui, pour des raisons différentes, des crises extrêmement profondes. L'État n'a pas été en mesure de répondre aux besoins légitimes de sécurité des populations, particulièrement dans les zones les plus reculées et périphériques. Par ailleurs, il y a eu une délégitimation de l'État parce qu'un certain nombre d'unités des forces de défense et de sécurité se sont souvent rendues coupables et malheureusement l'année 2020 qui vient de s'achever a encore été le témoin de très nombreuses exactions commises par les forces de défense et de sécurité dans les pays que je viens de citer, ainsi que cela a été documenté par les organisations de défense des droits de l'homme, qu'elles soient locales ou internationales. Et ces exactions, ces abus ou les exécutions extrajudiciaires qui ont pu les accompagner ont largement contribué à introduire de la défiance de la part des populations envers ces forces de sécurité formelles, donc dépendantes de l'appareil de sécurité étatique. Et dans ce contexte, on a vu émerger, particulièrement au cours de la décennie précédente, des acteurs armés non étatiques qui ont commencé à exercer leur autorité d'un point de vue sécuritaire sur des portions de plus en plus larges de territoire. C'est-à-dire qu'aujourd'hui, il y a aussi bien dans les pays sahéliens, en particulier au Mali et au Burkina Faso, mais de manière encore plus grave en République centrafricaine, des portions entières du territoire national qui échappent à l'autorité de l'État et où ce sont des groupes armés rebelles qui exercent leur autorité et qui assure la sécurité des populations qui sont placées sous leur emprise. Si je dis sous leur emprise, c'est parce que cette fourniture de sécurité se fait parfois va parfois à l'encontre de la volonté des populations elles-mêmes qui subissent les actions de ces groupes armés. Mais il n'en reste pas moins que des systèmes se mettent en place avec des milices qui sont rattachées à ces groupes, qui exercent aussi la régulation de la sécurité au quotidien, des missions de police, notamment au niveau très local. Parmi ces groupes armés, il y a bien entendu, notamment au Mali et au Burkina Faso, le rôle particulier des groupes djihadistes qui jouent un rôle non seulement dans la gouvernance de la sécurité, mais également dans la régulation sociale. On voit et sociale et économique. Si on prend par exemple l'exemple de la Katiba du Massina, qui est dirigée par Amadou Koufa, on s'aperçoit qu'elle joue un rôle central dans la régulation de l'accès à la gestion des ressources naturelles afin de prévenir ou de gérer les conflits de nature intercommunautaires ou intracommunautaires qui interviennent souvent entre les agriculteurs et les populations pastorales. Ça, c'est un exemple de gestion extrêmement localisée et qui se révèle assez efficace de la sécurité et espace qui échappe à l'État. On a aussi constaté, et particulièrement au Burkina Faso, mais aussi au Mali de manière différente, l'émergence de groupes d'autodéfense, très souvent sur des bases communautarisées et, point fondamental, à la demande des populations. C'est-à-dire que face à l'incapacité de l'État et de son appareil de défense et de sécurité d'assurer la protection des personnes et des biens, les populations se sont organisées de manière croissante. Et le cas des Kéogul Weogo, par exemple, au Burkina Faso, ou des confréries de chasseurs d'oiseaux, là au Burkina Faso encore, mais aussi au Mali et de manière encore antérieure en Côte d'Ivoire, donc les chasseurs d'oiseaux, ont joué un rôle de plus en plus important pour assurer la protection des populations, à tel point qu'aujourd'hui on voit un État comme le Burkina Faso qui considère que sa politique de sécurité doit aussi s'appuyer de manière croissante sur ces acteurs non étatiques. Il s'agit dont il s'agit d'encadrer l'intervention de manière légale et juridique, mais sans l'interdire. Le cas du Mali est un peu différent puisqu'il y a eu des alliances qui ont été faites par l'État malien, mais aussi par les forces internationales, comme la force Barkhane, par exemple, avec certaines milices locales ou groupes d'autodéfense, comme le Gatia, qui est le groupe autonome Touareg, Imrabd et alliés, ou le MSA, le mouvement de l'Azawad, ou encore la milice d'Anna Amassalou, en tout cas côté autorité malienne. Et donc on a assisté aussi à une sorte de politisation de certains de ces acteurs, ou en tout cas à leur instrumentalisation dans le cadre de la gestion du conflit actuel. Au-delà des acteurs, les logiques d'hybridité et d'informalité concernent aussi les normes. C'est-à-dire que, à côté des normes qui sont promues pour asseoir une gouvernance plus démocratique des systèmes de sécurité, par exemple la promotion de l'état de droit à travers les conventions et les traités internationaux, et au premier rang desquels tous les textes et instruments relatifs à la promotion et à la protection des droits de l'homme, existent aussi des normes informelles qui influencent beaucoup le fonctionnement de ces appareils de défense et de sécurité. Je donnerai par exemple le cas de la charte de Korugan-Fuga qui reste une référence très signifiante aux yeux de nombreuses populations qui sont des instruments qui parfois sont mobilisés dans le cadre de la gestion des conflits, puisque les mécanismes de gouvernance locale ne s'appuient pas seulement sur des acteurs étatiques armés, mais également sur des acteurs étatiques non armés, qu'il s'agisse d'autorités traditionnelles coutumières ou d'organisations de la société civile, locale ou internationale, qui utilisent des instruments de gestion des conflits fondés sur des normes beaucoup plus informelles et davantage ancrées dans l'histoire de chaque communauté. Ces phénomènes d'hybridité et d'informalité se retrouvent aussi dans les pratiques des forces de défense et de sécurité elles-mêmes. Et c'est un élément qui est absolument majeur. Si on prend le cas de la Côte d'Ivoire, par exemple, on s'aperçoit qu'à la faveur des mécanismes, des processus de réforme qui ont conduit à l'intégration des anciens rebelles du Nord au sein des FANCI, donc des Forces armées nationales de Côte d'Ivoire, des phénomènes internes de ce qu'on appelle la dozoïsation se sont développés, c'est-à-dire que beaucoup d'anciens combattants rebelles avaient été initiés aux pratiques de la confrérie des chasseurs d'ozo, et ce type de pratiques sont entrées à l'intérieur de l'armée ivoirienne à travers des mécanismes initiatiques auxquels se réfèrent toujours un certain nombre de combattants. Quand je parle des pratiques informelles des forces de défense et de sécurité, il s'agit aussi de l'économie politique de ces forces mêmes. C'est-à-dire qu'on parle très souvent de la corruption, et en effet, il y a toujours des scandales de corruption qui impliquent de très hautes personnalités au sein des États eux-mêmes. Il y a malheureusement eu des exemples de détournement massif des budgets des ministères de la Défense au Niger, au Mali et au Burkina Faso qui ont éclaté au grand jour il y a à peine un an, en 2020. Mais au-delà de ça, le fonctionnement économique de ces appareils de défense et de sécurité s'appuie sur des pratiques de détournement à toutes les chaînes, à tous les niveaux de la chaîne de commandement. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a des reventes de carburant par certains chefs d'unité, il y a revente des denrées alimentaires qui sont en principe distribuées à un prix préférentiel pour les personnels des forces armées. Il y a aussi détournement des soldes avec des pratiques et des politiques de gestion des ressources humaines qui sont fondées sur le gonflement des effectifs réels de ces forces. Et tout ça crée des mécanismes de prédation au sein des armées, mais également souvent des chaînes de commandement parallèles, parce qu'il ne s'agit pas le plus souvent de mécanismes d'enrichissement individuel, mais en réalité de mécanismes de redistribution d'un chef d'unité au profit de ces hommes aussi, et au profit de leur famille élargie. Et donc la compréhension du fonctionnement de ces appareils de défense est absolument indispensable aujourd'hui si on veut vraiment parvenir à les réformer. La compréhension du mode de gestion budgétaire dont je parlais, mais également du mode de gestion des ressources humaines qui continue à être très souvent fondé, non pas sur de la méritocratie, mais aussi très souvent sur de la cooptation. Anne parlait tout à l'heure de l'importance des mécanismes de contrôle et de supervision. Ils sont bien entendu très importants, mais je pense qu'il faut aussi se rendre compte qu'eux aussi fonctionnent très souvent de manière hybride et informelle. Les liens entre les commissions de défense et de sécurité et la sphère exécutive sont très souvent très étroits, et donc il est difficile de les concevoir comme des contre-pouvoirs. Et je donnerai tout simplement l'exemple de la commission défense et sécurité de la République centrafricaine sous les mandats du président Bozizé jusqu'à il y a 5 ans encore, enfin 7 ans, pardon, et plus récemment le cas de la commission défense et sécurité du Mali qui a été dirigée pendant 2 mandats par le fils même du président Ibeka. Donc forcément, ça crée des liens particuliers. Je terminerai ce tableau en parlant bien entendu de la politisation de ces appareils qui participent de cette hybridité qui est en question et dont sont le témoin les 2 coups d'État qui ont eu lieu au Mali en l'espace de 8 ans seulement. Donc je pense, pour conclure, que cette situation démontre aujourd'hui caractère dépassé, et je prêche contre ma paroisse, puisque je travaille sur la question de l'RSS, mais le caractère assez dépassé des questions de l'approche actuelle des processus de réforme des systèmes et de sécurité, qu'il faut revoir à la lumière de cette réalité hybride du fonctionnement de ces forces de défense et de sécurité africaines, et notamment en revoyant tous les processus de monitoring, d'évaluation qui sont fondés sur des indicateurs très quantitatifs qui ne prennent absolument pas en compte aujourd'hui, pour mesurer les progrès, la dimension informelle des appareils de sécurité africains. Voilà, merci.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. Bakayoko, pour cette excellente présentation qui en fait touche le point où le bas blesse, la gouvernance du secteur de sécurité en Afrique. Chris, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Sheikh. My presentation is going to be in English. Je ne parle pas français. You know, Western Canadian, you know, I haven't had enough time to spend in places I visited, including Côte d'Ivoire, Gabon in the past, so unfortunately, or Quebec for that matter. I'm just going to share a couple of slides that I want. It's always good to have some maps and some graphics, I think, to back up what I'm going to talk about, because I'm not going to talk as specific about specific conflicts, but I am going to talk about wider macro governance and security issues, which I think are shaping some of the forces, both internal to the continent, but external forces to the continent. And I just wanted to pull those up. So I was just in the process of pulling that up when Niogale finished. So let me just, give me 1 second, please. Sorry, it's just so much. Sorry, can I just go offline for 1 second? I'm switching.
You can stop your video. You should be able to share.
Maybe take a question from somebody else. I'm just going to take a second to find this. I don't know what, it just seems to disappear.
Okay, Sheikh, do you want to?
Yeah, I think I will just take some questions. We have a question saying, it's in French, I believe. Dr. Bakayoko, vous êtes là? Ce serait éventuellement pour Dr. Bakayoko. Devant la situation actuelle au Mali, croyez-vous qu'une plus forte régionalisation telle que préconisée dans l'accord d'Alger pourrait être positif ou au contraire néfaste au niveau de la résolution des conflits dans ce pays? Alors, je ne sais pas si Dr. Anne, est-ce que vous êtes là?
Oui.
Très bien, donc je vais vous passez la question. C'est une question qui est partie d'un de nos membres. Et c'est écrit directement to Anne regarding Ethiopia, the strategic mistake of Abiy Ahmed rocking the delicately balanced board of Ethiopia now has regional consequences in the Horn. Abiy trapped between common sense and his Amhara supporters. The neighboring countries are not stable either. Fragility of both Sudan and South Sudan are examples. Can you possibly sketch for us best case, middle case, and worst case scenarios?
Well, I should take Tag out for lunch and talk about that over a couple of hours. Tag, thank you for the question. Good to know you're online. Not an easy one to deal with in 1 or 2 minutes, but let me have a stab at it. And I think there's more context and discussion around this. I'll just put that on the table first. And I don't want to look backwards here. Let's not look backwards and try to lay blame, and let's look forward and look at the practical solutions, but also look backwards in the context of sketching out the best way forward. So I think mediation between Ethiopia and Sudan, soft borders are also something that will not be sustainable for democracies in the future. We can go on the basis of trust for only so long in cordial relationships, but you know, we need some resolution around not just that border, but other border issues. I think I've just had a message that somebody wanted to come. Will you come back to me, or was that for Chris? Do you want me to wait and answer this after Chris?
No, I think just go ahead.
Okay.
Just go ahead with your answer.
So I think some mediation between Ethiopia and Sudan, I think cessation of violence, reintegration strategies that are linked with a broader economic strategy for Tigray. You cannot, having been involved with DDR programs across the continent and in the Caribbean and Southeast Asia as well, you cannot have meaningful reintegration and support for people to transition to a civilian livelihood unless you have good economic opportunities for them to thrive in. And this is necessary with the amount of weapons in circulation that need to be DDR'd. I think those responsible for any war crimes and human rights, severe human rights abuses need to be brought to account and handed over to the courts. And we don't want any more loss of life here. We want the justice system to support the process going forward. Okay. I would say the humanitarian issue, definitely, and roads need to be rebuilt and unblocked, so all the humanitarian support doesn't have to go around Oromia and Afar. It can go straight up the road from Amhara. And elections will be held, which will give political legitimacy to one party and one leader. And I think that legitimacy and clarity about legitimacy is very important at the moment. The middle solution may be, and also an important part of the best case solution is that truth is established. And I feel that there should be some independent adjudication in whatever form to support the truth. It will be a positive thing for all sides going forward in the future, because some very extreme theories and narratives are being tossed around at the moment. The middle case, political agreement with Eritrea to push back, ENDF stay in large number in the region, which brings them out of their support role to other regions in the Horn of Africa where they're playing a very important role. There's resistance to DDR. And the worst case solution is there's no political level line drawn between Eritrea and Ethiopia, that the Middle East and Eritrea develop a bit of an axis. that there's no conflict facts established, and as a result, there's enormous pressure on Ethiopia to take on third-party intervention. And it continues to be a struggle to govern, and inflation breaks out. You know, there's a resistance towards investment in the country, which will cause other economic issues as well.
And maybe we will go to Chris to complete the discussion, and then we will come back to you and Mrs. Bagayoko to answer to more questions. Chris?
Okay, I'm here. Sorry about that.
Yes, yes. Anne has just spoken about some issues that certainly will be also covered by you to avoid any kind of duplication. I think I will suggest that we go with your presentation, and then that will give an ample space to answer the rest of the questions that we have.
Yeah, so I'm not going to speak specifically about the Ethiopian current crisis. But I'm going to provide hopefully some, again, it is a bit of a macro perspective on security trends in Africa, but that incorporate the sort of an overall external approach and the broadening number of external actors that have been more active across the continent of late, but also in terms of internal forces. So I really appreciate the detailed knowledge of Anne and Undeniably on their areas, and which they, given the work they've done, completely outshine my experience in those domains. But I'm going to provide a perspective that's, I think, a bit more, it's more macro, but the macro provides the environment for a lot of the micro work that still needs to be done, as both have pointed out. So my perspective is that the West has not changed its approach to the continent that much over the last 50 or 60 years. There have been mild improvements, learning as we go. But I think we've waxed and waned over time in terms of the Western approach to Africa, which is privileging stability above everything else, above democracy, above development, even above security and the broadly, let's say, a more human development or regional security approaches. Stabilization has wormed its way into almost every United Nations Security Council mandate. The word stabilization, right, is right there. And stability is, of course, important. But if we privilege stability at all costs, all of those things that we've already discussed about the role of civil society to keep governments accountable, to get their voices heard. And civil society could mean regional areas, it could mean specific voluntary groups and associations, it could mean ethnic groups, it could mean any sort of non-state actor who isn't armed, right? So civil society as that range of voluntary mobilization between the state and non-state armed groups. And the more the West, and again, it's not just the West, but the more the West focuses on stabilization and stability versus all of these other important elements, the less we're going to get security, democracy, and development on the continent and in specific countries. So I'm just going to provide some context, and hopefully this opens up debates, because this is controversial terrain that I'm gonna go on here, because people have different perspectives about this. So I just want to provide a really quick background, which is from about 2002, 2003 until about 2010, 2011, and 2012. The continent as a whole, again, so much variation, and it's not the same everywhere, but if you look at continental trends during that almost decade of the 2000s, was after the end of the major fighting of the civil war and DRC, it wasn't really a civil war, it was lots of external factors. The continent experienced its most peaceful period and rapid economic growth than any time since independence from that period. But what we've seen since approximately 2011, 2012 is increasing indicators, no matter how you measure them, increasing indicators of violent, contentious politics, politics outside the formal rules of the game. And we see that, here's the ACLED database, which people can look at. It's freely open to anybody to look at. But if you look at trends here, and again, if people, I assume everybody can see my screen fine if you're watching. The different, this is 2013 to 2020, the different trends amongst this form of number of events, which, violent, organized, armed events, where there are militias, political or communal militias involved. The trend, even though it's, year to year it changes, the level of casualties change, but the overall trends are going higher from 2013 to 2020. The extent of state forces involvement in armed events is going up. The trend line is up. The rebel groups trend line is up. So, and again, these are, you can look at and say, well, there's certain crises that are driving these figures, but as a continental macro analysis, violent, contentious politics has been increasing across the continent. And we know, we can name the conflicts. We can talk about Mali, Boko Haram, ongoing issues in Somalia. You can see the different sort of ebbs and flows, but the overall trends are up. And if you look at that from the overall trends, that means there must be something wrong with governance. When do people pick up guns? It's not just because all of a sudden they've picked up the Quran. It's not all of a sudden because they've been radicalized. The opportunities for people to pick up weapons in the absence of either effective state governance or state persecution drives people to go beyond just civil society and protest to the point of picking up guns and pushing back against the state or against other armed groups. So that's one trend. That's just overall trends. And again, these trends are just, again, more ACLED data that's focused just on Islamist violence and the increase in Islamist violence across different areas. And so, of course, Somalia has been the highest. The Lake Chad Basin has actually gone up of late, and people don't really sort of focus on that as much anymore. But, Islamist violence in northern Mozambique has shot up. Now, is that just because of the spread of this ideology? It's either Al-Qaeda or Islamic State. No, but it's a large chunk of that, of course, is related to the lack of both governance and economic opportunities, let's say in the northern parts of Mozambique, as well as security sector issues, the lack of effective security presence. But there's a combination. You can't just repress. You can't just have governance. You need, as Anne pointed out at the beginning, an effective professional military force to do the things we expect a state to do. But the state also needs to be doing the governance and the administration and the being responsive to its citizens. So we know that that's part of it. But the trends have really been concerning me since about 2013, 2014, when even just in my own work, I was starting to pick up more violence happening as opposed to the trends continuing from the 2000s. And so there has to be some relationship. And I know that these are all Western indicators and Western assumptions related to political and civil liberties, internet access, freedom of the media, freedom of civil society to form. But all of the trend lines, again, not just in Africa, but all of the trend lines for almost 14, 15 years across the continent have been decreasing the space for civil society. Now, yes, there are going to be specific states that stand out, and they're all going to be following the trend. But the decreasing space for civil society, the decreasing quality of elections in some countries. They might have had better elections in the past, and the elections, the space for real opposition is shrinking. And we've seen that recently. I mean, Canada's second largest aid recipient in Africa is Tanzania. The first one is Ethiopia. The second one is Tanzania. The current president has, early on seemed to have many good qualities in terms of stamping down on corruption and being really focused, laser focused in some ways on development. But in terms of his ability to put up with opposition, whether it's political or media, is very low. And he doesn't even accept that COVID-19 exists, let alone is a problem for Tanzania. So the experience that we've had in North America, right? And I always tell my students this, look at what just happened in the United States in terms of authoritarian tendencies in politics. It's not unique to Africa. It is everywhere in the world. But are those tendencies, if they play out too far, are they going to cause violence? Well, they did in the United States. So it's not a surprise that violence in many countries in Africa is actually increasing over the last 10 years and not decreasing. So again, that's the Freedom House indicators. This is just came out this week, the Economist Democracy Index. I don't agree necessarily with all of its measures here, but it is showing tendencies. And what I would put out there is that over this blessed rage for stabilization and stability over all of these other things that actually would make up a stable state is actually counterproductive. So, Canada, other Western election observers, just even governments when they comment on African elections, have a lower standard for African elections than they do elsewhere in the world. And that's problematic. And African politicians, the judiciary, civil society does see that. And so even when African civil society groups and populations and their judiciary see that their elections weren't free and fair, and they don't see those being called out by those who are still providing aid, both bilaterally and through multilateral institutions, the credibility of the West starts to decrease. And so that does increase the space for all of the other actors, right? I'm not saying there shouldn't be space for other actors, but the credibility of the West over the last 10 years across much of Africa, not just in terms of government, but in terms of civil society, has decreased. So just to look, one of the ways that this is one of the issues, this blessed rage for stabilization produces developmental, diplomatic, and security policies in the West, including Canada, which ultimately I think can be counterproductive to the ultimate goal of stability, but which should be, security, human security, development opportunities, et cetera, for people on ground in Africa. So we know that there's a great many, the major UN peacekeeping missions of today are in Africa, as well as many other multilateral or joint missions. So you think about AMISOM and Somalia, you think about all of the EU missions across the continent now that do everything from capacity building to, well, a lot of capacity building ones, but even some offshore in terms of, let's say, counter-terrorism, counter-trafficking, those kinds of things. So the EU as a player, as well as particularly France, right, has already come up in the Sahel. But this is just a map of all of the multilateral peace operations in Africa, basically 2 years ago. And it shows you, the multilateral and domestic, all the African different groups that are involved here, where there is considerable military cooperation across the continent and between the continent and other actors. So military cooperation is good, right? I mean, trying to have multilateral solutions to problems are obviously a good thing. That's an approach we need to continue. And this is another thing that related to this is the impact of the increasing dependence of all of these contributors, the EU, the UN, the United States, all of the funders of these organizations, the increasing dependence of multilateral operations, security operations in Africa on African militaries. So earlier, about halfway through last decade, it was African militaries who became the predominant supplier, the major supplier, over even the big three of Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. It's been African militaries that have supplied most, the biggest bulk of troops to UN peacekeeping. And that's even outside of AMISOM, which is, 95% African troops. So the dependence of the international community on African governments to supply significant military force in the most complex and dangerous multilateral peace operations actually puts African states and leaders in positions of leverage with the West. And if we don't understand that, and the relationship between that leverage and some of those governments decreasing governance as measured by the Abraham Index, democracy scores, political and civil liberties, we are missing part of the overall pie, which is overall violence is getting worse. It's not getting better as we have bigger, larger multilateral missions. There is something going on in terms of the security governance, security stabilization dynamic, which we need to change in some way to improve some of these governance and some of these the development outcomes. And again, this is very macro, and I know that there's lots of details in the micro and there's lots of good stories, but the macro picture is concerning. So one of the things, of course, is that the African Union has been better at having a more structured peace and security architecture, which the West has plugged into and supported, which is a good thing. One of the problems, however, has been the issue of subsidiarity between the African Union, its regions, and peace and security crises in Africa. So unless the UN Security Council just basically demands to focus on a particular crisis in Africa, it will wait until the African Union suggests you to do that. And the African Union generally won't move until the local or the regional organization actually puts the issue forward. And in some cases, for instance, the ongoing 4-year-long crises in Cameroon, it will never make it to the Security Council because it will never get past the ECAS, it'll never get past the AU, and certain countries on the Security Council will veto it. So there are certain crises which will be talked about. It will get to the point where it's actually a crisis, but a lot of crises will fester for a long time because of all of these, the insulation factors that many governments, Uganda's government, Cameroon's government, Rwanda's government, you can name quite a few, they are insulated from that kind of international pressure because of their key role as counterterrorism actors, as peacekeeping supporters. And that dynamic is actually problematic for longer term stability. It's not good for longer term stability. So I'm just gonna leave this here. This isn't even right up to date, but this gives us a sense of all of the different actors, the French, obviously, as Niagoli was talking about in terms of Sahel and Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali. But the French aren't the only ones there. Everybody is there. And there's more international military presence on the continent today than there was 5 or 10 years ago. And is that helping with international peace and security or regional peace and security in Africa? It doesn't seem to be helping. It seems to, in some ways, be escalating. It seems to change the dynamics. It seems to maybe make some parts of some countries more insecure. And yet there are real security crises that need to be dealt with. And so this is that the tough issue that the West needs to be smarter, and maybe that'll help with the Biden administration, but the West needs to be smarter in terms of how it works with African governments, works with African regional organizations, African militaries, strategic planning within African countries. And I would just say that the dynamic is not easy to change because a lot of those trend lines have been not changed since the 1960s. So I'm just going to leave it there. I just wanted to sort of throw a wrench into some of our thinking about this to say that there are broader international and regional dynamics at play here, where the focus on stability is sometimes getting in the way of actually that objective.
Merci, Chris. Thank you so much for your very good presentation. I am sorry for the technical issues that you got before, but we managed to resolve them. Now, we have many issues, and I will try to make sure that we don't concentrate only on Ethiopian issues. We will try to discuss some of the issues, and I have questions that I will transmit to you. This is from the ambassador from Sudan to Ottawa. I'm glad to see that you're online, Your Excellency, and thank you for your participation. With increasing tension and conflict in the Horn of Africa and some other regions in the continent, what is the best model or mechanism of conflict resolution to resolve this conflict? I will add to this question, I will combine with another question concerning West Africa, ECOWAS, la CEDEAO, Dr. Bakayoko. Some countries are making the case for the African Union and the United Nations to play a bigger role in maintaining peace and security in order to allow ECOWAS to deal with the much needed trade and development issues. Do you think that will be the best solution? What is your take on this? The question is for all of you. Dr. Bakayoko?
Oui, merci beaucoup. Je pense que, comme l'a très bien démontré la présentation du professeur Roberts, il y a aujourd'hui une crise, à mon avis, généralisée des mécanismes de gestion des conflits. Qu'il s'agisse des mécanismes mobilisés dans un cadre bilatéral, dans le cadre de coalition, donc dans un cadre multilatéral, exemple de l'opération Barkhane, dans le cadre de coalitions plus larges, comme le démontrent les difficultés de la coalition internationale pour le Sahel, qui inclut à la fois les États du G5 Sahel et les forces de l'opération Barkhane, qu'il s'agisse des mécanismes multilatéraux de type onusien. On voit très bien que malgré les rapports Cruz ou les rapports IPO qui ont essayé de réformer les opérations de maintien de la paix, qu'on appelle d'ailleurs maintenant opérations de paix, on voit très bien que la MINUSMA, malgré le cadre intégré de toutes les dimensions de l'intervention, peine elle aussi à changer les choses sur le terrain. Pour ce qui est des mécanismes purement africains, la présentation était intéressante parce qu'en effet, on est là aussi face à un échec, à mon avis, de l'architecture africaine de paix et de sécurité, puisque premièrement, on a vu que la force africaine en attente a été incapable d'être mobilisée en tant que telle, que les scénarios sur lesquels ont été fondées les hypothèses d'intervention de cette force n'ont pas correspondu à ce qui s'est produit au Sahel. On s'aperçoit qu'il a été quasiment impossible de s'inscrire dans le cadre sous-régional parce que ces crises sont transnationales et que les acteurs eux-mêmes, désireux d'intervenir, n'appartenaient pas nécessairement aux brigades auxquelles ils étaient affiliés. C'est pour cette raison qu'il y a eu le déploiement de cette fameuse MISMA, en anglais AFISMA, sous conduite africaine, donc placée sous l'égide de l'Union africaine, mais avec des effectifs à la fois tchadien, donc d'un État relevant de la CEAC et majoritairement de la CEDEAO, mais on voit aussi qu'a été créée une nouvelle organisation internationale, à savoir le G5 Sahel, précisément parce que l'un des pays, en l'occurrence la Mauritanie, n'appartenait pas non plus à ce dispositif. Et ça, c'est une certaine remise en cause.
Dr. Bakayoko, je veux juste attirer votre attention sur le fait que nous n'avons plus que 10 minutes. Et j'ai encore beaucoup de questions, donc si nous pouvons raccourcir un peu nos réponses pour qu'on puisse, les gens veulent vous attendre, ils veulent vous entendre, mes chers panélistes, donc essayez de raccourcir un peu vos réponses pour qu'on puisse satisfaire à toutes les demandes si possible. Ça va aller?
Moi, c'est bon, j'ai terminé. Hein. Oui, 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 moi,
Voilà.
j'ai terminé.
Oui. Docteur, professeur Anne?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Your Excellency in Ottawa, for asking that question. It's a very good question. I've been thinking about this issue, especially over the last 6 months, and I think what we desperately need, and where the West could help support the research for, is mechanisms and means and ways to support the transitions and the transitional management from more older style, in some countries autocratic, systems of governance, less supported systems of governance, to new democratic systems of governance that the West is sort of cheering for and firmly behind, but then easily abandons when things get a bit messy. You know, change is messy sometimes, and we need to know more about these kind of transitions. I mean, look at the case of Ethiopia. This is quite a unique situation where you have transformational change in the same party. And so victor vanquish politics is inevitable in these situations unless there's more research put into what can be done here. And we're going to see this more and more in African countries in the future as leaders, you know, and liberation struggle leaders will become older and into retirement ages and staying for the term in their constitution and being held to account by the population for that constitutional term, with new runners coming in. And we need some more work in this transitional management area. But also, I would say dialogue. I think where Africa leads the world is in dialogue. I had the distinct privilege of working for Thabo Mbeki, His Excellency Thabo Mbeki, with the High Implementation Panel of the African Union. And that panel did some brilliant work in just bringing together some really what were meant to be in the beginning some irreconcilable issues. But the problem was that the lack of funding and the lack of logistics and administration supporting that panel almost undermined it. And I know that the United Nations have built up a mediation support unit to a certain extent, and in small part the AU has, but we need more invested in mediation, reconciliation, and dialogue mechanisms. This is what Africa is great at. This is where we've seen traction been made, and we need the rest of the systems in place to support it, which includes the use of religious leaders and traditional leaders, which play an important role in conflict resolution tradition on the continent.
Thank you so much. Chris, you just talked about the importance of the international community. And recently, on the security front, the US reaffirmed its commitment to African security and stability. What are your views on the importance of the US commitment in Africa? And my next question will be also for Dr. Bakayoko. Si j'aurais bien voulu vous demander pourquoi, où est-ce que le bas blesse? Pourquoi le G5 Sahel traîne à être totalement opérationnel? I will start with you, Chris.
Right. So, yeah, President Biden, I think was it yesterday or was it this morning? I'm getting sometimes mixed up. He made a specific speech directly to the African Union, right? What are the odds that President Trump would have done that in his 4 years? I mean, he sometimes hosted people. So I think that it's obvious that there are other big actors in the world, but the United States ability to project power, whether that's hard power, soft power, attractive power, cultural power, et cetera, however you define it, is still the biggest player. And even in Africa, with the challenge of China's economic presence, China's increasing military presence, support for United Nations peacekeeping, we have to acknowledge that from China's side. The United States' ability to engage Africa, but engage Africa differently and smarter, is really a key thing that we need to all look for the, you know, in the next year, because really the tone of Biden administration's approach to Africa needs to be set in this first year. So the good part of that is the infrastructure is in place and can be modified, and that's, you know, U.S. aid, which is going to be revitalized under Samantha Power. AFRICOM could be the balance between AFRICOM's role and USAID's role in Africa. Hopefully the balance will shift back towards USAID, because for a while it was AFRICOM that was spearheading and leading. There's an ongoing battle with that. But the number of people that are within the national security and foreign policy community around Biden now that have experience in Africa, including the new UN Security Council ambassador, is actually quite impressive, right from Blinken on down. So I've been watching to see who he appoints as his Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, and up to a few days ago, I hadn't seen that appointment. But the people in and around the new administration that know different aspects of Africa is pretty impressive, and I think it's almost unprecedented in terms of any administration I can think of prior. Even the Clinton administration, who did have some of that around it, but in almost every position there will be Americans with experience on ground in Africa or related to African development and or security issues. So that's a good thing. Now, it doesn't mean that American foreign policy shifts overnight. There are still drone strikes going on, right? There is still the American military presence that Trump promised to or thought he was going to remove and just shifted it around a bit. There needs to be smarter, more multilateral approach in terms of working with governments, not telling governments, working with the international organizations, with countries like Canada that has a specific unique place in parts of Africa because of our 1 foot in the Commonwealth and 1 foot in the Francophonie. I would say that from a Canadian foreign policy point of view, if we were really wanting to make inroads with the Biden administration, we would play up that aspect in terms of partnership in Africa. And then the last thing I would just say is that the one area that's going to become really critical in Africa that the United States can play a major role in, it's not going to be critical, it is critical, but it needs more attention, is the maritime domain. So the overfishing, piracy is an issue, but piracy is basically a symptom of other issues. So, but it's really the overfishing in and around the African continent, which could be a way to mobilize American international support to help African governments in a security plus blue economy way. And there's elements of that already present in the United States in terms of the Navy and the Coast Guard. But that could be a real effective way to ending some security crises, but also to help with development.
Dr. Bakayoko.
Oui, à propos du G5, il y a évidemment plusieurs facteurs explicatifs. Le premier est qu'il était quand même extrêmement ambitieux de vouloir créer une nouvelle organisation multilatérale pour gérer une crise aussi complexe et multidimensionnelle que la crise sahélienne. Parce que, je le rappelle, le G5, ce n'est pas une force. Le G5, c'est une organisation internationale composée de 5 États dont le mandat est à la fois centré sur les questions de sécurité et sur les questions de développement. Donc, elle a été créée en 2014 et ce n'est qu'en 2017 qu'une force conjointe a été mise sur pied. D'autre part, il y a le problème des contributions sur le terrain en contingent que les États apportent ou non. Il y a par exemple ce fameux serpent de mer du 8e bataillon que le Tchad a promis de déployer depuis des années et qui ne l'a toujours pas été. Il y a aussi le problème des forces qui se réfèrent à leur commandement national davantage parfois qu'au commandement intégré. Il y a le problème de son articulation avec la force Barkhane, même si cela s'améliore. Mais surtout, avant tout, pour moi, il y a le problème des procédures internationales de mobilisation des fonds et des procédures administratives qui y sont associées. C'est-à-dire que quand on organise des conférences de donateurs où sont annoncés des dons de centaines de millions ou de milliards, il faut savoir que le déblocage de ces fonds prend énormément de temps, doit satisfaire des procédures extrêmement strictes et qu'il ne faut pas s'attendre à voir les promesses de dons se matérialiser du jour au lendemain, ni les dotations logistiques. Et on s'est heurté à ce problème-là, par exemple pour la mobilisation des fonds qui venaient de l'Union européenne, sans parler des fonds qui ne se sont jamais matérialisés, par exemple comme ceux de l'Arabie saoudite.
Merci infiniment, Dr Bakayoko. Merci, professeur Anne. Merci, Chris. Nous n'avons pas le monopole de résoudre tous les problèmes de gouvernance en Afrique, et spécialement pas les problèmes de gouvernance du secteur de la sécurité. Il y a beaucoup de questions dont on aurait pu discuter, mais je vous remercie d'avoir pris ce temps et votre discussion, votre présence ont été honorables. Ça serait tout pour aujourd'hui et Chris, je te retransmets le tout pour ton allocution de clôture. Et merci encore une fois, chers panélistes, et merci aux participants. Thank you very much. Bye.
So this is Bruce. I'm not sure that Sheikh was giving the word to let a chance to Chris to speak. One of the challenges I think that we have learned at the Africa Study Group is if we're going to have 3 panelists, we need to actually program for more than an hour and a half because we will run out of time to answer all the questions. And there are a number of questions that haven't been allocated. I would just note in particular that we are hoping to have a session or cooperate with the session with others on the issues around the Horn of the Africa, and in particular the Tigray and the changes within Ethiopia. For the moment, the next Africa Study Group event that is scheduled is for the 3rd of March, and it will be on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And it will be actually starting at 9:30 on the Wednesday morning, because we will have somebody from Addis Ababa who will be speaking to that. We'll be providing more details later. We are also co-sponsoring an event on civil society and the government in Zimbabwe, which is being organized by SIPS at the University of Ottawa next Wednesday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Alors, j'aimerais bien remercier nos invités, et c'est justement cette capacité d'aller chercher le monde à travers le monde. Bon, on n'a pas encore essayé quelqu'un de l'Asie. Le décalage horaire serait peut-être a challenge particulier dans ce cas-là, but it's been a great pleasure to meet Anne and Niagale, to reconnect with Chris, who we had on a live panel in Ottawa a year or so ago. And I wish you, thank you very, very much. Au nom du groupe de réflexion sur l'Afrique, on vous remercie beaucoup de vos réflexions et nous espérons alors que vous allez pouvoir continuer dans l'avenir. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon and a good weekend, everybody. And hopefully we will all progress. I think that when we solve the COVID problem, we may continue to have Zoom calls anyway, because they're clearly something we were waiting to discover in the previous life. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, Niagale.